let me try and inject a note of optimism. Thank you very much, Iris, for that thoughtful introduction. I suppose the optimism might come from the question mark in my title, A New Age of Extremes, question mark. And let me thank Iris and the President and Dury College for this invitation to give the 18th Annual Kim and Fryer Lecture. It's an honor to have been invited to commemorate a great figure in the world of modern Greek studies, a pioneering translator who did more than anyone in his time to bring Greek poetry to the attention of the English-speaking world, a man who began his life in the last years of the Ottoman Empire and ended it on the other side of the Cold War, a man who was familiar through his personal experience with the plight of the migrant, the refugee, and the exile, a man who combined the self-effacing modesty of the translator with the courage that he showed in his opposition to the junta, a man who richly deserved the honors he received on both sides of the Atlantic, and above all, a man who loved Greece and who left behind one of the most extraordinary archives we have on modern Greek poetry. This evening, I want to explore the idea of an age of extremes, a phrase coined, so far as I know, by the late Eric Hobsbawm, and to ask how useful such an idea is today. In particular, I want to offer a historian's perspective on the idea that we're living through an age of extremes here in Greece, and more generally, to raise some questions about what the relationship is between the present crisis and the crisis of the mid-20th century. Now, no one wrote more clearly than Eric Hobsbawm, a great historian from whom many people have learned a great deal, myself not least. Nevertheless, in the case of this particular phrase, the age of extremes, there is less than his usual clarity. Although it provides the title for his history of the short 20th century, it's always a little ambiguous, I think, what he means by it. He makes clear that the century was one of unparalleled violence and destruction. He emphasizes that it saw the definitive destruction of the last vestiges of traditional agrarian society as capitalism brought people together in an apparently inexorable advance into a single unified system of exchange. But did the phrase refer to these things? Or did it refer to the ideological confrontations that accompanied and produced them? What in particular did Hobsbawm regard as the basic ideological confrontation? Was it that between fascism and its enemies in a war which had seen communists and capitalists unite? Or was it the struggle between capitalism and communism itself, or some combination of both? One thing is clear. Europe's mid-20th century crisis was a period of unprecedented mass killing, and so you can't divorce the idea of an age of extremes from the question of violence. Whether you're talking about the new violent mode of politics that emerged on Europe's streets after the First World War, or the violence of mass state incarceration and mass murder that became visible first in the Gulag and then in the Nazi concentration camp system that reached its peak a decade later. To me, it seems plausible to see the interwar age of extremes as the moment in which the politics of the word, in the most general sense, was replaced by the politics of direct action and by a politics of, how shall I call it, militarized mobilization. Everybody seems to have been always marching around in the 1930s. Now, historians have spent years trying to agree who was a fascist and who was not, and what connection, if any, we should draw between the violence of the left and the right, and I will return to this question below. But the fundamental source of the rise of both between the wars lay in something that historians have studied much less, a deep crisis of parliamentary democracy. Remember that in 1918, this was regarded as the great victor of the First World War, and parliamentary regimes with new constitutions were established throughout Europe. By the 1930s, most of them had become discredited, and democracy had given way to dictatorships of one kind or another, almost all of them on the right. Behind this lay a devastating, widespread loss of faith in the capacity of the institutions of parliamentary democracy to cope with the problems of the modern world and, above all, the problems posed by capitalism. And so you can't discuss the idea of an age of extremes unless you're also going to talk about the basic problem of the relationship between democracy and capitalism. In the 1920s, a certain vision of capitalism prevailed. The economic orthodoxy of the day mandated a return to gold standard, or in other words, a system of fixed exchange rates, and international capital flows in open economies in which workers were expected to bear the brunt of adjustment by falling wages. These policies, pursued through the first institutions of international government above all the League of Nations, contributed to a deflationary spiral worldwide that led to falling living standards and rising debt. Identified with these phenomena, democratic politicians were discredited. But so was something more fundamental, the politics of discourse, of the word, of the exchange of views within a common forum represented by a functioning multi-party system. Indeed, that system itself was identified widely as the source of democracy's weakness, and political parties were seen as tools of sectional interests or vehicles for powerful economic forces. And so there arose instead the idea that you would create a better world through the vehicle of a single party or movement. And let us recollect too how difficult it was, especially in Europe, to restore the prestige of democracy after the nadir of the 1930s. First of all, it required a world war and the comprehensive defeat of Nazism and fascism, thanks to the combined forces of the Red Army and American industrial power. And then, equally importantly, it meant a complete rethink by Europe's politicians of what democracy needed to encompass, a rethink in which they learned, primarily from communism, I'd say, but yes, also from Nazism too, how to build a new relationship between electorates and capitalism, how to make full employment and the struggle against poverty and ill health as integral to a functioning democracy as votes and laws and constitutions. And that meant rethinking capitalism and the balance between national autonomy in economic matters and international connectivity. In 1945, the extraordinary Hungarian polymath Kol Polanyi wrote a prescient article, I think brilliant article, on the choice that faced the world as the war ended. That choice was, as he describes it, the choice between an American ideal of global capitalism and a Soviet model of regional planning. Now, in fact, as we know, between 1945 and the 1980s, Europe focused on the national and the regional, while allowing for the gradual internationalization of trade. The re-establishment of democracy that took place after 45 was thus accompanied by decisive repudiation of the economics of the 1920s in favor of greater state control of the economy, nationalization, exchange controls, and regional planning. All of this happened with the blessing of Washington and under a dollar international monetary regime, helped along by international institutions that had also learned the lessons of their failure between the wars. The result was a period of unprecedented economic growth and, in most countries in Western Europe, political stabilization. But things started to change in the 80s and 90s with the rise of neoliberalism, and at that time, as Washington changed direction and moved back towards what Polanyi had called global capitalism, the French and the Germans tried to accelerate monetary convergence and opened up Europe, or agreed to open up Europe, to international capital. The current crisis, above all the crisis of the Eurozone, has shown up, I think, the weaknesses of this model, and it's revived the old problem of democracy's relationship with capitalism. That relationship is not under threat in Europe's creditor nations, and you can be jolly sure it would be taken more seriously if it was. But because there's now no mechanism for adjusting balance of payments disequilibria within Europe systematically, this can provoke an ongoing crisis in the debtor countries that has no obvious end, and so it has. Balance of payments surpluses are piling up in Germany, and southern Europe is being consigned to long-term unemployment. And yet, the geopolitical challenge is still there. Everywhere in Europe, the question is how to preserve some meaningful semblance of national independence and sovereignty in a world where individual European states will face unbearable competition, I would say, globally, from China, from India, and from elsewhere. How, in short, can the European model, which was intended to enhance Europe's room for maneuver vis-à-vis the rest of the world, be reconciled with democracy? These questions are posed in an especially acute form today, here in Greece. Before I move then to an analysis of the situation in Greece, let me address the question of what it means to compare left and right at all. Compare does not have to mean to equate. The idea that fascism and communism are intrinsically alike was one that became popular in the Cold War and spread rapidly amongst American political scientists in the 50s, who developed a theory of what they called totalitarianism, which dwelt on the commonalities between the systems of government in the Third Reich and Soviet Union. It was a theory that was abandoned, I think, for some very good reasons in the light of subsequent historical research, but it's been revived again relatively recently. And today one can find some good historians, actually, returning to this idea, insisting on the kindred nature of Nazism and communism. Now, from the perspective of a liberalism that sees individual liberty as the supreme value, this argument may seem plausible. After all, the two regimes killed far more people through state action, were far more violent in that sense than any others in European history. On the other hand, all the obvious ideological differences between the two kinds of outlook and regime, their credos, their relationship to liberalism, their modes of thinking about politics itself, have to be overlooked. One thing we can say for sure is whatever Hobsbawm meant by the age of extremes, he did not mean to endorse this idea of the fundamental kinship between fascism and communism. And if I stress this, it's because the totalitarianism thesis today is a point of departure for some in Greece, because for some, particularly in or supportive of a government which sees itself as embattled on all sides, it has some purchase. The government, and I would say especially New Democracy, has talked a great deal in recent months about the need to combat the twin extremes of right and left. The memory of the interwar era and of Weimar as a kind of warning from history has been evoked by the Prime Minister in this spirit. Speaking in memory of Eleftherios Venizelos last month, another New Democracy MP recalled a statesman who had, he said, and I quote, always fought against the extremes. And this in turn, as you know, has led Syriza and the Kukuwe in particular to protest against what they call a propaganda peri άκρων, which they view, I think correctly, as a way of delegitimizing them. Now, I'm myself broadly sympathetic with their critique, and I don't think very much of the totalitarianism thesis, and I'll say more about it. But I do think the issue of the crisis of parliamentary democracy and of political institutions in general is sufficiently serious in Greece today to warrant looking at the various kinds of positions that have been taken by both the extreme left and the extreme right on fundamental questions of political power. We could have an interesting philosophical discussion about what we mean by extremes. We could talk about how such language is always perspectival, how it presupposes a kind of normative centre from which the extremes come to seem like extremes, and how therefore such a phrase itself involves a set of covert or overt judgments about what's good and what's bad in politics. After all, as a New York Times journalist recently discovered, viewed from the perspective of exarchia, it's the government itself that's acting in a totalitarian fashion. We could, and maybe we can continue that line of discussion afterwards. But I want to cut short the political philosophy to define my terms. To talk about an age of extremes presupposes a certain attitude towards the existing state institutions. That is quite true. They are there to be defended, says this view, against those who would completely destroy them. But then, as I see it, in the context of the metapolitevsi, the great lesson that most Greeks learned from the junta was indeed the need to defend their democratic liberties within a parliamentary system. In that sense, they demonstrated their faith in the new institutions, and they voted pretty systematically all the way up until the spring of last year for one of two major parties, both of which, with quite different visions of where Greece should go, shared a common acceptance of this basic understanding. But as you know better than I, what happened under the pressure of the crisis was very dramatic. Not only did one of those parties, PASOK, suffer one of the most precipitous declines in electoral support anyone can remember, but the overall party landscape changed out of all recognition. Entirely new parties sprang up, some older fringe parties disintegrated, some others did brilliantly well. For a time, politics seemed to revolve solely around the question of whether you were for or against the mnemonio. But opposition to the mnemonio became increasingly difficult to distinguish in many quarters from opposition to the entire course of the metapolitevsi itself. For some, it was in fact a short step to go on and denounce post-war democracy, usually in the name of some higher, purer and better democracy. This opposition was couched increasingly in terms of the defence of the nation, of a meaningful national sovereignty, of resisting those who would sell the country out to the plutocrats, the financiers. It's thus in Greece that you see in an especially acute form what you see in many countries, the emergence under the pressure of this great crisis of capitalism of a new discourse of national independence that regards the existing political institutions not merely as culpable, but as basically rotten and, yes, illegitimate. And this is connected, of course, with the unmistakable evidence of endemic political corruption on the one hand, and on the other hand with rising political violence in the streets, TV studios, and shopping malls, and now even in hospitals. The biggest winner the first time Europe experienced a systemic crisis of parliamentary democracy was the radical right, and its striking success, sweeping much of the continent in the 30s, is one reason to take the present rise of the extreme right in Greece very seriously. The more so as it's something entirely new to the Greek scene, something you simply cannot say of any other political force in the country today. A force which had always been marginal and in electoral terms now represents in the shape of Golden Dawn what some pollsters say is possibly the third largest party in the country. It's a fact which cries out for analysis and explanation, and it offers the single most compelling reason, I think, to talk about a new age of extremes in Greece. I think we need to reflect on the sheer novelty of this situation, not least because too many politicians, especially in the government, still act as though Golden Dawn represents business as usual, rather than a real rupture with the democratic tradition, and the most serious threat to it since 1974. The fringe right has always been around, but the emergence of a force, paramilitary in character, espousing an ideology of biological racism, regularly involved in acts of brutality and violence, brings us closer than ever before to the situation of the 1930s. If you read Golden Dawn's programme, you're struck by its own sense of its novelty, by its desire to explain itself at incredible length to those who might be tempted to join it. It contains a weird kind of running discussion with critics and historians. The website reminds readers that in the bad old days of pre-crisis prosperity, Golden Dawn was written off by its detractors as extremist, fascist criminals, if you wish. Οι άκροι, οι φασίστες, οι εγκληματίες, αν θέλετε. But it goes on to insist, all historical analogies are quite untrue. I'll come back to this point later. Those who speak of Weimar are mistaken. Golden Dawn is, quote, a purely Greek political phenomenon. It has no relationship to other states and historical periods. And they make the same point in a pamphlet. Είμαστε Έλληνες εθνικιστές, we are Greek nationalists. Invoking, bizarrely, I have to say, the historian Stanley Payne, the authors go on to denounce loose usages of the term fascist as a relic of leftist propaganda, and they assert, and I quote, Golden Dawn is not a fascist or a Nazi movement, since at the epicenter of fascism lies not the nation race, but the state. We are neither statists nor Italians, they go on, just as we're not Germans or Nazis. Rather, they claim as proud Greeks their credo is based, quote, on the nation race, eternal Hellenism. Okay, some commentary may be helpful at this point. In the first place, let's be clear. Golden Dawn has an ideology, and a pretty clear one, and you only need to read the party programme to see it. Second, every fascist party, worth its salt, always highlighted its impeccably national credentials and often believed in them too. They made sure they had their own colour for their shirts and their own national symbols. Sartorially, to be a fascist between the wars meant wearing a brown shirt in Germany, a black one in Italy, green in Romania, blue in Spain, grey in South Africa, gold in Mexico. I can't resist mentioning in this context Woodhouse's spoof on Sir Oswald Mosley, the British fascist, who appears in his 1938 comedy The Code of the Worcesters as Roderick Spode, leader of the much-feared Black Shorts. None of this, of course, meant there were not substantial ideological affinities with other, older and more prestigious movements. Quite the contrary. The insistence on your national credentials went alongside endless copying and borrowing of both content and presentation. And Golden Dawn's no different. It may say it's for the nation, not the state, but that doesn't really affect the question of whether it's like its interwar predecessors or not. It's quite true that Italian fascism developed a kind of ideology of the state, but this only happened after the movement came to power, and there was always an anti-statist current in it too. Moreover, it remains to be seen what Golden Dawn would start saying about the state if it found itself in control of it. We don't really need to get hung up about Italian fascism. I think the much closer ideological affinity is between Golden Dawn and German National Socialism, an extreme right-wing movement that always remained ideologically ambiguous about the state. But there are other more important echoes of the ideology of Nazism too. First and most obviously, there's blood, race, and biology. Golden Dawn's manifesto is saturated with references to this. It talks about the secret voice of the blood, η μυστική φωνή του αίματος. And it's this racialism that marks the sharpest contrast with the much more traditionalist views centred on the church and on foreign policy goals of older right-wing groups. It's not surprising, perhaps, that its supporters have spilt so much blood or spend so much time hanging around blood banks. Blood is on their minds, the right blood, the wrong blood, just as it was for the Nazis too. Anti-Semitism is less central to their programme than it was for the Nazis. On the other hand, there are plenty of references to what is regarded as the greatest enemy of all, the immigrants, who supposedly endanger Hellenism, especially in its current enfeebled demographic state, who constitute the foreign element in the national body, who must be expelled to restore the nation to health. Substitute immigrants for Jews, and the commonality of approach is striking, as is the street violence employed in targeting and intimidating. Also reminiscent of Nazism is the attitude to capitalism. Like the Nazis, Golden Dawn is against both the international plutocracy and communism. It stands against big business at home and abroad, but it's for the small property owner, the family businessman, the farmer. It's against the memorandum, of course, at all costs, and in favour of a return to a policy of autarky and self-sufficiency. And it's in this context that Golden Dawn finds a model in, of all places, Israel. It's here, in this desire to turn inwards, to raise the drawbridge to keep the world out, that the new anti-globalization nationalists return to the thinking of the 1930s. You couldn't hope to find a better example of the old-fashioned, almost nostalgic element in a movement which sets itself up as a vision of the future. We've seen this vision of the future before, and the world has changed too much. I mean, think about Israel itself, after all, a country now far removed from the days of the kibbutz. That's what Golden Dawn talks about in rather glowing terms on its website. It's become a leading high-tech industrial power dependent on exports and migrant labour and on its close military alliance and financial support from the United States. Or think about how things turned out last time these right-wing experiments in national self-sufficiency were tried, in the 30s. In Greece, repudiating foreign debts did indeed mean a move towards autarky. But this movement brought only temporary and partial success, and it certainly didn't increase the country's security or independence. On the contrary, the country was invaded less than a decade later. Interwar Germany offers an even more salutary test of the autarky idea. When, after 1933, the Third Reich tried combining a policy of nationalist belligerence and racism with love of the land and anti-capitalism, not even the resources of Europe's most prosperous and well-organized state could bring success to a program that was riven with internal contradictions. Basically, this is the bottom line on this kind of Nazi program, it's no good planning to go around starting wars and recovering territory if at the same time you want to send the national economy back to the Middle Ages. Golden Dawn wants to urge Greeks to go back to the land, to start from nothing in pursuit of national self-sufficiency, and at the same time to pay for a military that will make good all the national claims in northern Epirus and Macedonia and Cyprus. This implies wars without the means to win them, and how? By moving, they say, Greek foreign policy away from America and Europe and relying on whom? Russia, as it turns out, if you read the manifesto. How becoming a satellite of Russia would enhance Greece's independence and bring prosperity is never really spelled out. Compared with this, the foreign policy program of National Socialism was a model of rationality. But the main feature of Golden Dawn's ideology that I want to stress is what it says about the existing political institutions in Greece and its attitude towards legitimacy in general. For me, this is the most important. It is, of course, vitally important for it to be seen to be legitimate. And so it emphasizes more than once that, as it puts it, enas nomimos politikos schematismos, nomimotita is at the heart of this. Electoral respectability is now crucial, but it combines this with a promise of complete change. It regards the entire existing institutional apparatus of the metapolitevsi as something that needs to be swept away. And like many interwar critics of parliamentary government, its attitude towards political parties in general ranges from ambivalent towards hostile, and its program proposes a form of people's state in which, quote, the people, or laos, hold political power without komatikous proagogous. And what is the laos? Well, they tell us, not merely an arithmetical quantity of individuals, but a qualitative synthesi anthropon με την ίδια βιολογική και πνευματική κληρονομία. What it terms the current fake array of left and right, it says, is not real democracy. Real democracy is one in which ο λαός είναι μόνη πραγματικότητα, που δεν χρειάζεται εξουσία, αλλά ηγεσία. And here, for all the professions of constitutionalism, we get a hint of something else. Ο λαός είναι ο πραγματικός άρχοντας. Ηγεμονεύει τον εαυτό του μέσα από την ηγέτη του. What does that really mean? For one brief moment, amid a string of euphemisms familiar to anyone versed in the doctrines of interwar fascism, the nasty figure of the dictator peers out. To me, at least, all this is strongly reminiscent of Nazi ideology, with its talk of a community of the Volk, of a polity run by a movement that serves to express the will of the community of the Volk as it emanates from the mouth of the Führer. It seems to me that people should be taking all this a lot more seriously than they appear to have done to date. For let's be clear, its enmity is directed not merely against immigrants and other foreign elements, reflecting the deep anger omnipresent here now at the entire political class. I'll return to this topic. It also divides Greeks, those of Greek blood, into real Greeks and what it calls mere Ellinophonie, betrayers of the nation. In short, it operates on a classic Schmittian basis. The essence of politics, wrote Carl Schmitt, is what he called the friend-foe distinction. And as Schmitt pointed out so brilliantly in his writings from Weimar, such a distinction is difficult to maintain with the values of a parliamentary democracy. The Greek state has given few signs until now that it recognizes the gravity of this situation, or that it understands the implications of a movement whose violence is not merely theoretical or rhetorical, but enacted on the streets. The latest story a few days ago from Tripoli, the intrusion by a Golden Dawn squad into a hospital to conduct random checks on the papers of nurses, strikes me as signalling a deeply disturbing new phase in which the movement feels sufficiently emboldened actually to enter state buildings and to act in the name of the state without any fear of punishment. When the state fails to defend its own monopoly of force and fails to protect its citizens, its society and its institutions, we will see people organizing in their own defense. And at that point, we will indeed be in a situation like that of Weimar, where the weakness of the state created a vacuum of power that a variety of different groups filled. We're still some way from that, but not as far as we should be. In that sense, the Prime Minister is absolutely right to talk about Weimar, but wrong in who he's picking on to prevent a repeat of its fate. Which brings me to the left. Golden Dawn's rhetoric is, of course, anti-communist, although actually there's less anti-communism in the manifesto than you might have expected. Anti-communism remains maybe more important for many elements in New Democracy. Thus, when, for instance, a New Democracy MP made the speech I referred to last month in memory of Venizelos, he said, at least in the published version of his remarks, nothing about the right as such in the context of extremes, but he singled out instead, and I quote, Marxist, communist and Leninist theory, as though we were back in the Greece of 1929, before the rise of Nazism, with a powerful Soviet Union and a new piece of anti-communist legislation, the so-called Idionymo, I guess only the historians now remember it, setting the foundations for the anti-communist state that was to emerge over the next half-century or so. And yet it should be perfectly obvious that we're not in 1929 in that sense at all. One major difference in general with the interwar crisis of democracy lies in what has happened since and what we know. On the one hand, the USSR is now history. I read that today the French Communist Party, you may have read this too, has decided to give up the hammer and sickle. On the other, communism as such is by now an entirely established part of the Greek political tradition. Indeed, the Koukoue is the oldest continuously existing party in the country, I believe, and its mostly aging electorate cannot seriously be regarded as a threat to anything, least of all to the institutions of parliamentary democracy. Now, of course, so long as there's been a communist movement in Greece, there's been also a penumbra of other Marxist movements ranged around and often against it too. Trotskyites, maybe another dying breed, Maoists, as well as a range of anarchist groups, some of which predated communism. We have, to my knowledge, no serious study of this subject, nor of the ways labels such as anarchiki and anti-exousiastiki have been deployed, sometimes by people in their own name and others by their opponents. Cumulatively, they've never amounted to much in electoral terms and still don't, certainly not since 1974. So it's hard for me to understand why squatters, for instance, should be viewed as a symptom of some slide to a general state of anomia, In comparison to the scale of the threat posed by Golden Dawn, they're an irrelevance. Obviously, they are there to be singled out as part of some political or party strategy by forces who want to attract the law and order vote. And equally obviously, in this situation of extreme economic fragility, property rights are more vulnerable and therefore more highly charged than ever before. But I want to insist on the basic point. The extreme left as such is an electoral irrelevance and no real challenge to the existing institutions. Of course, a fringe of that left has taken up arms and violence, as Charis mentioned, ever since the fall of the junta. Groups like November the 17th never really believed in the metapolitevsi at all. Greece to them had remained under foreign occupation, indeed for some of them ever since 41. The Americans had taken over, but the oppression of capitalism continued. And yet did November the 17th, for all its success in remaining undetected, for all the popular toleration of it, it must be said, ever really constitute a threat to the metapolitevsi? It seems to me the only serious answer is no. It was an embarrassment, and it was, of course, a source of violence and murder and deep anxiety to some, but it didn't threaten post-war democracy. Since late 2008, street violence has increased in fits and starts, initially in the throwing of Molotov cocktails and arson, and now in the latest disturbing spate of attacks on shopping malls, party offices, and the residences of prominent figures. Viewing the police as the enemy, there can be little doubt of the basically and fundamentally oppositional character of this violence. It's anti-institutional in the deepest sense. Now, compared with the threat posed by the right, it remains secondary, but you can't be surprised that the state should seek to uphold its monopoly of force when confronted by it. In this sense, responding to the raids on the Villa Amalia by resorting to arms was simply bound to prompt further police action. And for some of those involved, of course, the fight was what they wanted. Here, too, I think you can only talk about a section of society that's given up on parliamentary democracy, on the word itself. Is it coincidence that its targets include those who transmit the word publicly, journalists, and resorted to a strategy of violence? That the far right is becoming influential, especially amongst the forces that guarantee the state's monopoly of force, helps to explain this sense of spoiling for a fight. On the streets, maybe especially in Athens, the impartiality of the police is far from guaranteed, to put it mildly. But the result of extreme left-wing violence is to associate the slogan of law and order with the far right too, and that has real political consequences. Indeed, it seems to me that the government's chief target in clamping down on these groups, and in particular in bringing together the fight against leftist terrorism with the struggle against squatters or trade unionist or ecological activists, is not so much these small groups themselves as the larger world of the Marxist left in Greece. There's a political game being played here. But let's be clear why the game can be played at all. Why, after all, could the episodic real violence of scattered anti-exousiastiki be thought to pose any kind of problem at all for the leadership, say, of Syriza? The reason surely is that real violence, when it occurs from the left, comes as an embarrassment to its leadership and that of other left-wing political parties, precisely because, for all their often implicitly or explicitly violent rhetoric, they do not in fact mean it to be taken seriously in that way. We need, in other words, in thinking about the left, to think primarily about why its rhetoric is so far removed from what it feels comfortable doing, where its phrases and memories come from, and what they really mean. Now, in the decade or so after 74, there was a really radical transformation in Greece's cultural and intellectual life. And it wasn't only that the Communist Party was legitimized. It was that the country's entire recent history, above all that of the occupation and the resistance, could be thought about and publicly discussed, and that was quite new. The right was dethroned, the resistance itself was legitimized. This reassessment took place both in the sphere of politics, where Andreas Papandreou, for his own party purposes, turned the resistance into a foundation myth PASOK, and in the sphere of academia. In the universities, a brilliant younger generation returned home from exile, and debates about the resistance and the war and the place of the left generally contributed to an extraordinary renaissance of history and social sciences. It's not only contemporary history that's prospered in Greece since 1974, but it's perhaps benefited more than most, precisely because it was marginalized, if not silenced previously. and in turn this spilled over into pamphlets, memoirs, and a massive array of writings that shaped the consciousness of a new generation of left-wing activists with no personal memory of the 40s at all, but who saw their own struggle to remake Greece in the 80s and 90s, to transform its institutions in terms of a continuation of what the left had been doing in the antistacy. Much, but not all of this happened within an intellectual atmosphere that was Marxisant, where it was not self-consciously Marxist. Indeed, since 1974, Marxism has formed and continues to form a vital part of this country's intellectual and cultural life. And I say this as someone who does not count himself as a Marxist, but is conscious of how much I owe to intellectuals like Eric Hobsbawm, or for that matter, Nikos Voronos. It's been a huge force for a kind of liberating intellectual energy in many domains of thought. But precisely because the Greek left today comes out of this powerful Marxisant milieu, a milieu that, unlike those elsewhere, never had to make a mental break with the image and ideal of revolution. I think here we come to some of the reasons why you have a fringe tradition of violence in Greece. There was never that break with the image of revolution. But on the contrary, was accompanied by a new stress on the importance of the historical memory of resistance and armed struggle. The question is complicated of the relationship between this great weight of an intellectual tradition and the rhetoric of the left today. I find the contrast with the extreme right instructive. For Golden Dawn, the past is something to be repudiated if it's to prosper electorally. As we saw, denying any connection with the past is something it goes to great lengths to do. For the left, on the other hand, its connections with history are to be upheld at all costs, even when they're actually misleading. Especially, I'm tempted to say, since politics became a struggle for or against the mnemonio. This increased the temptation to use the vocabulary of the 40s and to speak as though the country faced a new occupation and new forms of collaboration and resistance. And I think in particular that Syriza's fragility, its extraordinary heterogeneity, could be overcome, for how long we shall see, by this kind of appeal to history. In a way, a kind of hearkening back to the strategy of Andreas Papandreou in the 80s, except that Syriza is even more fragmented than PASOK was, much more. The result was mostly, in my view, a kind of rhetorical excess, a way of attracting votes in pursuit of the drive to find radical solutions to the country's problems, but it could be taken seriously as a call to arms, and it has been by some. And now this image of the anti-memorandum militant, rooted in the glorious struggles of the past, becomes a kind of rhetorical Frankenstein for Syriza itself, one which its opponents can take full advantage of. Of course, it must be emphasized that this revolutionary rhetoric on the left that I'm referring to is linked at the same time to a serious, often self-questioning collective effort to think through the crisis. Some of the most serious recent work, for instance, on the economic background to the crisis, comes out of the Syriza milieu, if I can put it that way. In this, it forms a striking contrast with the right, whose intellectual poverty could not be more obvious. It's instructive, for instance, to read New Democracy's website. Its ideational content about its ideology is about as brief as it can be. In fact, something which I think is an asset to the party rather than a drawback. They have no ideology to have to defend. That's an enormous asset for a party. As for Around Golden Dawn, there's simply nothing, to state the obvious, to begin to compare with the quality of intellectual production in and around the revolutionary and quasi-revolutionary left in Greece. And so here's the challenge for the left. Given the powerful grip of the world of Marxism revolutionary thought which has shaped it, can it realign rhetoric and reality? Can it bring itself to explicitly embrace the institutions of parliamentary democracy? And can it do so, above all now, in the most unforgiving circumstances, when the institutions of parliamentary democracy have been so discredited by all the stories of the past months and years, by endless corruption, and of course by the policy of austerity itself? The most unforgiving circumstances, but also the most necessary, given that the country faces the deepest institutional crisis it's known for decades. To do this will mean not abandoning, but finding a new relationship with those historical memories and inspirations that it draws from the years of resistance above all. It will mean translating them from an idiom of resistance as opposition, to something more constructive, less negative, more participatory in the messy business of government. It will mean giving up the idea that this is another occupation, and that the business of government is a form of collaboration, and that will leave it in unfamiliar and uncomfortable territory. Responding to this challenge falls to the left, I think, because it has a vital part to play in ushering the country through the current crisis. The anti-institutionalism, the anti-statist character of Golden Dawn on the one hand and the extreme left on the other is connected, obviously, to the idea of dirty hands, to the critique of bicomatismo and to systema. People everywhere are outraged at the way, it now seems in retrospect, the two major parties of the post-war era colonized the state and took it over as though it was theirs. The critique of metapolitevsi, Golden Dawn talks about the end of the metapolitevsi, gains traction from the idea that the construction of public institutions after 74 was primarily a matter of private and party gain. And so the key political challenge is to find a way to restore the credibility of the institutions of the state and of public life, to find a conceptual space in which to talk positively about the state without appearing to condone corruption. The two major parties have been completely unable or unwilling to do this. Both of them have acted, and I think continue to act, as if corruption was really someone else's problem. And the question of the Lagarde list has been all too revealing, although the problem goes much deeper. So who can fill the gap? Who can find a persuasive way to talk about a renewal of public institutions in a credible fashion? It falls to the left because the left occupies that political space which identifies itself with the idea of a properly functioning public sector, despite, or maybe because of the current pressure from abroad to dismantle it. But that means facing up to the inadequacy right now of a kind of rhetoric that valorizes uprisings, resistance, the struggle against, of trying to define that always elusive moment, quote, when the time is right, a time which never seemed quite to arrive. Can it do that? And can it do that now, in a moment when to make such a transition would inevitably arouse shouts of capitulation before the forces of international capitalism? I don't know. But of course, a real crisis of democracy raises the question of which institutions you're defending, of the relationship between political liberties and civil life on the one hand, and workers' rights, unionization, and the struggle against the power of capital on the other. The Marxist inheritance has tended to say they're indistinguishable. That is to say, you can't defend political rights meaningfully unless you defend the social and economic rights too. If you try to make that distinction, you are in fact serving the interests of capital. In the vocabulary of an older generation, you're a merely bourgeois democrat. But in this matter, what was the lesson of the past age of extremes? It seems to me the lesson was very simple. Timing is everything. In Weimar Germany, it was the split within the left and between the left and the center over these very issues that ushered in the victory of National Socialism in 1933. Many compromises were necessary on all sides, and much blood was spilled before fascism was defeated. Much more before it was possible to restore the institutions of a functioning democracy in Europe, especially in Greece, which had the misfortune to pass through its own second bitter internal conflict, a conflict that only ended, as I believe it did end, in 1974. That is the real lesson and the real achievement, in my view, of the metapolitevsi, and it's one that should be defended today in the face of all its critics and despite their often justified criticisms. But to defend the achievement of the metapolitevsi is going to need something very hard, a real rethinking on all sides of the historical categories in which we talk about the present and we define political possibility. Let me end by saying that it seems to me that one of the deepest features of the crisis has been to engender a widespread feeling of powerlessness and a desire amongst all sorts of people to do something, to do anything, to assert their own sovereignty in a world which is reducing them to ciphers. One can only sympathize with this sense of wanting to become an actor, a sense which I see stretching right across the political spectrum. And yet the prerequisite, surely, for knowing how to act is knowing how and what to think about the situation we face. And this is maybe where history can help, not least because history is so much on people's minds and tongues right now. In this lecture, I've tried to suggest one way how. Thinking with history need not mean thinking oneself back into the past, as though emancipating yourself from the present can be achieved by replaying the past with a new ending, happy ending this time. Thinking with history can also mean thinking about what's changed and what remains, about how to emancipate yourself from history, and about the categories that can confine. We're in an old situation, and we're in an entirely new situation, and both are true. And a lot of work lies ahead before we can figure a way out. Thank you very much.